Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
All right, Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well, Dan.
I am too. You know, one of the shows that we did that I really enjoyed was with Preston Dennett, and we talked to him about the Ariel School incident, and of course, a big part of that discussion was the character of John Mack, who interviewed some of those kids after that episode there in Zimbabwe. Well, we've got somebody today, fortunate enough to have someone on our show today who's very well versed in that person, and of course I'm talking about John Mack, the person who interviewed those kids. We have Ralph Blumenthal on our show today, and he's written an award-winning book on on John Mack, and that book is entitled The Believer. So, Ralph, let's welcome you to the program. How are you doing today?
Great to be here. Great to be with you guys. Thank you.
Are you coming to us from New York City?
No, I'm in Exeter, New Hampshire, where I teach in the summer and where the incident at Exeter took place.
I was going to say that UFO. You must either follow the UFO connection or the UFO connection must follow you.
Well, I'm at ground zero here. This is ground zero.
Cool. So I was reading a little bit about you, and one of the things I read about you was that you were your college newspaper's editor. And I think that said something about your trajectory in life. So what got you into being a journalist and writing books like the one about John Mack and others?
Wow. Well, I went to City College of New York, which is a great urban institution it actually invented free tuition, free higher education and free tuition. And I was an art major, actually, going into college. And I wanted to be an artist, which didn't have a lot of career prospects, as my father pointed out to me, but I loved it. But one day I walked into the newspaper office and I was completely hooked. I mean, these guys were cool. They knew everything going on campus before anybody else. They were respected. They had tremendous ego gratification because their names were in the paper every day. So that was for me, and I never looked back. I became editor of the City College campus. I went on to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism after City College, and then I went right to the New York Times, first as a copy boy and then a reporter pretty quickly. So that was it. The next 45 years just passed in an eye blink.
You, as I recall, got some notoriety, won some awards with the New York Times for investigating the World Trade Center bombing, at least the first one. Was that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. In 1993, the World Trade Center was attacked by guys with a car bomb, a truck bomb in the basement. And what no one realized then, unfortunately, was that this was the warning call for 9/11. The same people behind it, but the FBI and the New York City Police Department were not prepared to understand. They couldn't translate the documents that they seized. They arrested these guys pretty quickly. They solved the case pretty quickly, but they didn't know that these guys, the perpetrators, were part of a worldwide group of terrorists who were bent on bringing down the towers, which they did 8 years later.
So how did you then go from that incident to writing about a gentleman like John Mack?
Well, it's, life is full of synchronicities, and this was one of them. I was a New York Times correspondent in Texas in 2004, and I picked up a copy of John Mack's second book called Passport to the Cosmos. It just kind of literally fell into my lap somewhere at a used bookstore, and I was really impressed with the fact that this guy was an esteemed professor at Harvard. He had won a Pulitzer Prize writing about Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. He was an esteemed member of the Harvard psychiatric, firmament. And yet he was interested in aliens and alien encounters. So I said, gee, this has got to be a good story for the New York Times. Now, I had no idea that he was already really famous. And he'd been on Oprah. He'd been written up in the Times. It had all escaped me. So I was going to call him up for an interview. And a few days later, I picked up the paper to find he'd been run over in England and killed by a drunk driver. He looked the wrong way, as Yanks do in England, and he was run over. He was almost 75 years old, but he still had a lot of his career ahead of him. And so that quashed my dreams of interviewing him, but it still excited my curiosity, who he was, who he had been, how he got into the strange field. So I made contact with his family, and they were obviously very bereaved, and they weren't in the mood to talk to me about the future. But eventually I kept at it, and they were forthcoming, and they gave me access to all his archives, his journals, his tapes, his therapy sessions, his unpublished manuscripts, etc. So that's what got me started.
Well, it's a great book. I've gotten to look at it the past couple of days here. So let's go back to kind of origin stories about John Mack. What leads Mack, and your research on him, what leads Mack to this enigmatic story about strange things in the sky, UFOs? How does he get there?
Yeah, it was an unlikely journey, life's path for him. Again, synchronicities. He was very firmly grounded on planet Earth. He, as I said, he had won a Pulitzer Prize investigating the life of T.E. Lawrence in England. He spent a dozen years on that. He was very devoted to social causes. He brought mental health care to Cambridge at a time when Cambridge was a very downtrodden part of Boston. He worked, for the poor, and he did a lot of social causes work. He campaigned against nuclear weapons because, as a doctor, he knew what nuclear war would do to humanity. And as a result of his Lawrence biography, he got very interested in the Middle East. So he tried to make peace between Israel and the Palestinians, as we know how that worked out. Not too well, but he tried. He met with Yasser Arafat. So he had all these causes. But he was also, I should say, by the way, that he was brought up very conventionally. He came from a wealthy household, a German Jewish household. His parents were both professors. His stepmother and his father, his birth mother, had died when he was very young. And so he was not really very spiritually minded growing up, which is interesting. But at one point, after all the things, as I said, he did on planet Earth, he went out to Esalen to explore the interesting experiments that were going on there in the 80s. Experiments with drugs, which he tried, hallucinogenic drugs, but mostly with breathing disciplines that gave him another level of consciousness. By breathing to music, he could almost access a past life, it looked like, in some ways. So the story I tell in my book. Anyway, he got very interested in the spiritual aspects of life and the fact that there was more to the world than the four corners of our everyday reality, okay? And then he got an introduction to a guy named Bud Hopkins.
Hopkins, very familiar, right?
Very familiar name, I'm sure, to you and your listeners. And Bud Hopkins had been involved in alien abduction research before John Mack. He was an artist, so he didn't have the professional standing or background of Mack, but he was a very bright guy. He taught himself hypnosis. He hypnotized, experiencers and got their stories. And so John Mack met him through a series of steps I outline in the book, and was amazed that there could be these experiences, people who said they encountered alien beings. And nothing prepared him for that in his psychiatric training, but he surrounded himself with some of these people. started talking to them, getting their stories, and he was hooked. I mean, that's it.
Dave, feel free to jump in here, any juncture here.
Well, what I'm having trouble wrapping my head around is that, so I want to know, Ralph, your timeline as far as working at the New York Times and when you became interested in some of these alternate subjects, because the New York Times, of course, while having obviously broken some very important stories over the decades, it's still considered what you might lump into a group called mainstream media, right? And so I'm wondering how you, first of all, allowed yourself to move into some of these areas, but also how were the interactions between you and your colleagues, your superiors in general at this newspaper? And I'm interested in knowing what your experiences were within that realm, which is typically separate, very separate from the realm that we're moving into with Bud Hopkins and John Mack and everybody else.
It's a good question, because the Times is not known for its reporting on anomalous subjects. Let's put it that way.
No major newspaper is, or media outfit in general. But yeah, go ahead on that.
No, you're right. There is a general skepticism in the mainstream media about anomalous subjects. There's, some suspicion, hostility even. The Times has reported on UFOs, by the way, if you go back. Written many stories about encounters with UFOs, not so much about alien encounters. But anyway, so what happened is I had been working on the John Mack book since 2004, as I said, since I found out he'd been run over and killed. But my beat at the New York Times was really investigative reporting. I reported a lot on the mafia, on law enforcement, corruption, political corruption. I did a lot of arts reporting, a lot of different things. Again, very well grounded, like John Mack on planet Earth. But by the way, I left the Times, retired from the staff after 45 years in 2009. So while I was working on the John Mack book, I had retired from the Times, but I continued to contribute articles, which you can do as a longtime staff member. I freelanced for them and some other publications, but the Times was a happy home for me to take my articles on various subjects.
Of course, yes.
So in 2017, a good friend of mine, Leslie Kane, who I had met through my research on John Mack, she's sort of the preeminent journalist on UFOs, wrote a famous book on generals and pilots who recounted their experiences, and a real authority on UFOs. And I got to know her through my research. She had been really the last partner of Bud Hopkins. And she actually introduced me to Bud, and I got to interview Bud for my book before he died of cancer. Anyway, Leslie came to me one day in October of 2017 to say that she had been to a meeting in Washington where a group of people, including Lou Elizondo, who was the head of this Pentagon office to investigate UFOs, which nobody knew about, attended this meeting, and she was invited to the meeting. And Lou confided that he was quitting the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which was the Pentagon office, secret Pentagon office looking into UFOs, because he wasn't getting enough support, in the Defense Department. And so Leslie learned about this Pentagon UFO office, which nobody knew about. And she said, "Do you think we can get a story in the Times?" And I said, "Boy, I think we can, because it's quite a sensational story nobody knew about." I mean, the government officially said it was out of the UFO business with Project Blue Book in 1970. So I took the story to editors I knew at the New York Times, including the highest editor, and they said, "Go for it." So we did the story, with another reporter from the Washington Bureau, Helene Cooper, who covered the Pentagon. And we broke that story on the front page on a Sunday on December 17th, 2017, with some videos of these encounters that we got a hold of, showing thermal images of these objects, whatever they were, radar tracks, eyewitness accounts from some of the pilots, and we broke that story. So that's basically what started it, and it was a sensation because the Times, as you said, was not known for, breaking these stories. It had a very solid record as, in science. And by the way, the story was, if I have to say it, very well sourced. There were no anonymous, sources. It was all on the record. We named the officials. Harry Reid, the former Senate Majority Leader, had gotten the money for this program, with black money, actually. It was a secret program in the Pentagon budget. But we got that story. We interviewed Harry Reid. So that's what started it. And then we did a few follow-up stories. But that was the story that made the difference.
So I should sort of backtrack on my claim. It was the New York Times that did break this story that's really continued for 4 years since then. I mean, it doesn't go away, which is a little bit surprising. It's been, on CNN front page just a couple weeks ago, this newer, that's one of the other questions I wanted to ask you about is how new is all of this? Obviously, it broke a few years ago, but wasn't the data held in reserve for a while? I mean, the videos themselves, the so-called Tic Tac UFO and other information is actually quite old, isn't it?
Well, that's a good question. The encounters, first of all, go back through time immemorial, obviously. Right. I mean, there are accounts, in the Bible and in all kinds of folk histories of encounters with strange objects throughout recorded history. Mm-hmm. And it really got going with Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947 of what was called in the press popularly flying saucers in 1947. Then there was the crash at Roswell a few months later. Or something crashed at Roswell. We still don't know exactly what it was. But anyway.
How many crashes there were at Roswell?
Well, and not only at Roswell, but anyway, let's say the post-war period brought a lot of attention to this phenomenon, whatever it was. And there were a lot of sightings in the 50s and the 60s, and then there was the Betty and Barney Hill abduction story in the 60s and all that. So, and I trace some of this in my book, the history of UFO sightings by thousands of people. Right. And the government, for a long time kept saying, oh, they're seeing the planet Venus, they're seeing swamp gas, they're seeing reflections off the desert floor. And this was nonsense because these people knew what they had seen. And a lot of them were veterans of World War II. After the war, there were a lot of veterans walking around, and they know what strange objects were. They were pilots, and they knew what they were seeing. So anyway, let's jump forward to after the Times broke that story about the encounters, about the UFO unit in the Pentagon, the ATIP we called it. And the fact that there had been a whole flurry of encounters seen by an aircraft carrier group off San Diego in 2004, and then again in 2015 off the East Coast. Mm-hmm. The government decided it better put out some kind of report. There was a lot of pressure for a report. And the Defense Authorization Bill at the end of 2020 actually required the Pentagon to produce a report for public consumption on just what it knew about UFOs. Not everything it knew, because some of the stuff was classified. And when the report came out, June 29th, I believe, in end of June this year, it didn't say much. It just said that there were a lot of things that the government couldn't explain, a lot of sightings. One incident it could explain, so it spent a lot of time talking about the one thing that it could explain. It was a weather balloon, but all the other things it couldn't explain, it didn't spend that much time talking about those things. But the fact is, there were a lot of things that the government could not explain.
Well, and that itself is significant, right? I mean, my reference to the Tic Tac video, well, you confirmed what I was saying, is that it actually goes back, whatever that is, 15, almost 20 years. You're looking at 2004 when some of at least this group of this data that came out that we're now seeing in the news. And my point was that it's been out there for a long time, but the fact that the New York Times broke this and made it very high priority for every news outfit, really, I mean, Fox News, CNN, everybody plastered this on the front page. So the power of the media obviously is huge, because I would bet that most Americans and most people around the world had no idea that this had been going on for 10 or 15 years, let alone the 100 or centuries that you and we all know. If you've looked into this phenomenon, you know it's been going on and on and on. There have been waves up and down through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 90s. I mean,
right.
It's there, but the power of the news media can create the narrative and bring in a lot more eyeballs and brains to consider the subject. And so that was what happened in the break, New York Times reporting was, again, what date? The first
December 17th, 2017.
So it was 4 years. Seemed more recent than that, but it was already 4 years ago.
Well, we put out a number of stories since then. There was a story about close calls, that some of these objects really came very close to military jets, and almost seemed to cause an accident. Now, we don't know what would have happened if they had collided, whether these things, would have actually crashed into a military jet, but they came close enough for the pilots to see it. And then we did a story, a very difficult story, about the fact that congressional committees were briefed on apparent recoveries of materials from crashes. And a lot of that information remains classified. It was a very hard story to get. I'll just say it again, a very hard story to get.
Oh, yeah.
Information is hard to come by. And the most concrete thing we could get was the fact that congressional committees were actually briefed with slides that mentioned off-Earth vehicles and materials. Now, we don't know more than that. What kind of materials are recovered? Were they alien material? All that stuff remains unsubstantiated. But congressional committees were briefed on it, which is pretty significant. So, and that was really the most recent story of the series. A lot of this information was floating around the internet. There's a very robust community of ufologists, online. But as you said, the fact that the Times was recognizing the phenomenon and reporting on it prominently elevated it to a new importance, because it's good that people online are talking about it, but it doesn't have the same credibility. The Times standards for verification and on the record and all that does stand for something. I'm proud to say that as a longtime career New York Times reporter. So there's a lot of information on the internet that's pretty sensational, but in many cases it's not confirmed. It doesn't hold up to the same rigorous scrutiny that the Times story did. So anyway, it's useful that this stuff is out there, but there's a reason it doesn't cause the same excitement, because it's a grab bag. Some of it is is backed up. Some of it is not. There's rumor. There's all kind. Some people are trained journalists. Some are not. So it's hard to know.
Well, I'll let Dan get back. I know he's got his own list of questions. I just have one more thing, and that's that the To the Stars Academy, which is Tom DeLonge and Elizondo and other people. What is your opinion on that outfit? There's been a lot of back and forth in the UFO community about how useful, helpful this group has been. Are they just in it to sell merchandise? Is it a disinformation campaign? I mean, what are they really helping the issue or not, in your opinion?
Well, I don't want to give my opinion on that, because basically my opinion doesn't really count. They've done a lot of hard work on this issue. They put out some videos. They put out material. Tom DeLonge is, very invested in this issue. We try to keep our distance just because they were partly an entertainment outfit. They were trying to produce entertainment as well as scientific breakthroughs, and there was no reason why we, needed to involve them. We were very careful to maintain our own sources and our own, information. So I don't want to get into that. I mean, Tom DeLonge has done some serious work in this field, a very interesting effort that he put into it. But we were very careful not to tie ourselves to any other group or organization, just because the Times was trying to be pure about this and keep
now,
itself
do
separate.
you consider this last thing, Dan? I'll give the mic back to you. But
that's okay.
The UFO community, of course, has for decades been clamoring for so-called disclosure. I consider the New York Times several stories on this to be, well, it's the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, who has enabled this with probing by New York Times, of course. But do you consider this to be a form of disclosure? Or is it the beginning of disclosure? Or is it not?
Well, there was a lot of speculation that this was part of some master plan, of the Pentagon to leak this stuff out. Mm-hmm. I can tell you from what I know that we were not spoon-fed any information as part of any conspiracy. We worked very hard, Leslie and I, and Helene Cooper, to get this information out. It was not a plot to leak it through the New York Times. We heard about it. We pursued it. My years of experience in reporting at the New York Times leads me to be very skeptical of conspiracy theories. It's very easy to think that something was engineered in a certain way to come out a certain way. And I know from my experience that we worked very hard to get this information out. It was not, a devious plot to put it out a certain way through the New York Times. Mm-hmm. It could have gone the other way. We could not have heard about it. The editors could have turned it down. A lot of things could have happened that changed history, but the stars were aligned. We worked hard at it. We got the information, and we made a case for it. So, it helped disclosure, so-called disclosure along the way. A lot of information came out that probably was ripe to come out. Not enough of it, in my opinion. There's still too much that's being held back. Historically, too much was held back. There was disinformation historically by the government, very nefarious activities by, the Air Force and other branches to obfuscate the issue, to put out, false information. There was that. The terrible plots by the CIA to inject people with drugs and test drugs, and all that is true. They did that. So there's a kind of a sordid history behind this to some extent. But that did not, poison our reporting in any way or influence our reporting in any way.
Well, and it really has changed the narrative too. The skeptics can no longer say, oh, that's just a bunch of hooey, that's nothing, that's not scientific, no serious agency or person would even consider UFOs, because for decades that's how it's been. But now that it's front page news, now that New York Times and the CNN and MSNBC and everyone else is saying, look, here, this is directly from the Pentagon. We've vetted it. We've talked to witnesses and so on. They can no longer say that this is a topic that is unworthy of scientific exploration. So,
right.
It's a change. It's a very fundamental change. And that's what I'm kind of calling disclosure, at least the beginning of it. It's not, as you said, spoon-fed necessarily, but it is a big change in how it's perceived, at least among the public.
Right. No, I'm really glad you made that point, because the one thing that is absolutely new now, and the breakthrough, is that these objects are physically real. We don't know, nobody knows what they are, where they come from. Are they intelligently controlled? Who's behind the wheel? But for a long time, as you just said, they were dismissed by the so-called skeptics and debunkers as, bug specks on the windshield, and hallucinations and all that. And we now know, thanks to the radar tracks and the FLIR thermal imaging devices and the eyewitness accounts of pilots, but mainly the scientific detection of these objects, that they are real. There's a physical dimension to them. And again, as I said, we don't know any more than that, but we know that now. And that is a big breakthrough.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very fundamental difference between just a few years ago. So Dan, go ahead. I know you got a big list. Go.
Well, you've got some important questions too.
Well, those are my big ones. I really wanted to get Ralph's opinion on some of those things.
Sure. Let's bring it back to John Mack, because I just find him kind of a fascinating character. Now, you mentioned that he lost his mom when he was fairly young. I don't remember how old he was when she died, but that the trauma that was caused by that seemed to kind of be a factor that really affected him, which you would expect it to. That maybe he, and I think he also, in your book, you talked about he had an uncle that was ill, and there was, I don't know if that influenced him going into psychiatry or the helping professions or not. So did you see that connection with trauma?
And I spend, a lot of the beginning of the book tracing his psychological development because he was such a pivotal figure in the field of alien encounters. So it's important to know, what influenced him and where he was coming from. So it did turn out that his mother, his birth mother, died of appendicitis when he was 8.5 months old. And it was a terrible trauma for a young child to lose his mother. He didn't understand why she was suddenly gone. They had invented, penicillin had been discovered, developed by then, but it was brand new and it wasn't given out widely enough. So she died very quickly after developing this infection. And so his whole life, he was searching for this missing mother figure. Now, his father, who was his father was a professor at City College where I went, and he was there. His father was a professor in the English department when I was there as an English major. So talk about synchronicities. I didn't take a course with the father, but I knew who he was. And so his father remarried another professor woman who was very tough and brilliant and hard driving. And she had, created some issues with the young boy because, stepmothers do that. So, and then on his birth mother's side, he did have an uncle who had mental health issues and needed a lobotomy. So he sort of was interested in mental health from early on. So that drove him towards psychiatry. But he had this search for the missing thing in his life, which I think, and he himself recognized it, translated into a search for something missing in the universe, some intelligence that was out there that we don't understand. So that was definitely a factor. It is interesting that he would be driven by that. And when he went for his holotropic breathwork training, which is what got him into understanding that the universe was not just the four corners of reality that that everyone sees, but there was something else going on in the universe. He went through this breathwork, and he was taken back to the womb. He felt that he felt his mother giving birth to him and turning blue. And he turned that into a story about Pinocchio and the turquoise maiden who helps Pinocchio, through his challenges in life. And it's really interesting to listen to a psychiatrist analyzing himself, which is what John Mack did. I mean, he went through therapy, and I got some of his tapes, his own tapes, where he talked about his own psychological and psychiatric development. So anyway, he remembered, or thought he remembered, what it was like to be stuck in the birth canal while his mother tried to push him out. And he thought that was pretty amazing that a human being can be carried back to early memories like that. So that prepared him, before he met Bud Hopkins, that prepared him for these stories of people who had these amazing encounters. So he said, well, if I can be brought back to my birth, maybe other people are remembering things that also seem to make no sense. So that was an interesting part of his own development.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the video I saw of him interviewing those kids at the school in Zimbabwe, because you could tell these kids were traumatized because they saw some stuff that they couldn't wrap their heads around. And just his gentle way of talking about what happened to them, I just sensed that sensitivity to trauma. That seemed real obvious.
As I said, his uncle had been, had these mental health issues. So he was, you say, he was open to, as I say in the book, the sources of suffering. But when he went to Zimbabwe to talk to these kids, by the way, he was a very charismatic character, John Mack. He was tall. He had cobalt blue eyes. He had a wonderful way of interacting with people. Men and women were drawn to him magnetically. And children, too. He had 3 sons of his own, but he was very good with children. He would literally get on the floor to talk to them on their level. And that was one of his gifts as a psychiatrist, by the way. He really interacted with people and got them to talk to him and tell them their stories, even when they were outrageous stories. So when these kids, when the story circulated in, I believe, 1995, I forgot, right around then, that there had been some kind of an incident in Zimbabwe at a school for children outside the capital, that some kind of craft had landed, and the kids said that they saw alien beings. He flew there, and he interviewed these kids, and the interviews are on tape, and I have them. And these kids, this is, one of the things that was so persuasive to him, that children who, you can't say that they're making this up for publicity, or that they're recounting the books they've read about aliens, or this was about, some movie they saw. These are kids of 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. And John Mack was always impressed by what he called the affect, what psychiatry calls the affect, the outward signs of emotion that people have. And he got to be good at that in, figuring out, are people, lying to me, or is this an authentic experience? And he said these kids really projected authenticity. And when you watch the tapes, which you can do because some of them are online, it really is interesting. These kids are very earnest. And he's asking them questions, what did you see and what did these beings say? And the kids say, well, they communicated with us telepathically, like the words just popped into my head, which other people, other experiences have said too, that the beings didn't speak English. The words just popped into the heads of the people. So the kids were recounting this, and they described them as short, child-sized beings in some kind of uniform, with mesmerizing black eyes, and these stories, which were so consistent, not just in Zimbabwe but all over the world. People were telling these stories, and people of all backgrounds and ages, and young and old, and professional. So that's what was so convincing to John Mack, among other things.
I remember reading his first book. I never read the second book, but his approach seemed very sound in the sense that he didn't come right out and say, if I remember, and that's been a while since I read the book, if I remember correctly, he didn't come right out and say, well, these people have been abducted by aliens or UFOs, but he said something very traumatic has happened to them, and he believed that they believed something traumatic had happened. And I like that approach without him coming right out and saying, oh, I totally buy into all this alien abduction kind of thing.
Right. Well, I disagree with you a little bit. I'll tell you why. First of all, the book was very authoritative. It was called Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens. It came out in 1994. He tried to write peer-reviewed articles, by the way, and he couldn't. They wouldn't accept his articles. They were too long, for example, first of all. And the subject was too controversial for a lot of professional journals. So he finally gave up and wrote this book. Now, the book basically contains 13 case histories of people whose names he alters for their privacy, but some of these people later came forward and owned up to their own stories, and they did their own publicity. But anyway, they're very detailed case studies of these people. So John Mack took a lot of trouble to trace their early history, before their encounters, what the encounters was, what the people thought about it afterwards. So anybody who's a skeptic or a debunker needs to read these things first. And I'm very, critical of the so-called skeptics and debunkers who rule these experiences out without spending the time, as I have and other researchers have, to look into the stories themselves, because you can't just dismiss it without knowing what the stories are and why John Mack and others took them so seriously. So anyway, so he recounts these stories in great detail with great care, but he did make some mistakes in leading people to believe that he was adopting these stories as true himself. He endowed them with great credibility, and he could have been, and perhaps should have been, a little more distant in recounting the stories and then saying, we don't know because they're so strange, they don't conform to our notions of reality. In the second book, he backed away a little bit from the certainties of his first book. So that's where I take issue a little bit with what you said about him, not giving these stories complete credibility. In a way, he did, and that's what got him into trouble at Harvard. It looked like he was buying the stories hook, line, and sinker.
Now that's a tough one, because it seems like it's almost inherently where you end up once you get into these fields, is that it's very hard to stay objective, first of all, because you're dealing with so much emotion. But even beyond that, you have become a part of the phenomenon, you could argue, in certain ways. I mean, you look at Whitley Strieber, right? He started making pilgrimages down to Central America or wherever to go on these vision quests. And I mean, it opens doors that are very tempting to go into, and you could argue, is a logical next step. Once you start understanding the experiencer's journeys, you start believing them because they're very believable and authentic. And so you can't blame people who end up in an area where they're extremely susceptible to even more skepticism. And it's tough. I admire you, Ralph, because you seem to have walked that fine line between being an authority and being a part of the cult, so to speak. At least from an outsider's perspective, you will eventually be called a cult member or a true believer or whatever, insult that come up with. There's so many of them. But do you agree that that's where you will probably end up the more you pursue these things? Or is it possible to stay on the right side of the line and be that consummate scientist and not an experiencer yourself?
Well, it's very hard. I grant you that, because the one thing that comes through, the more you study these accounts and the more you meet these people, and I've met a lot of them myself, that they are absolutely credible people. Except for this experience, they would be considered absolutely normal. The only thing abnormal about them really is this experience that they are firmly convinced that they had, and that you could say there's fragmentary evidence they've had. But let's leave that apart. That otherwise these people are completely normal people. So the more you look into these stories and accounts, the more puzzling it becomes. That's the problem. There is no easy explanation. And again, the quibble I have, no more than a quibble, the argument I have with the skeptics and the so-called debunkers is that they come up with these explanations that don't explain. And John Mack took a lot of trouble to examine all the possible explanations and found that none of them really explain it. It is a complete mystery. Now, you have to say that there are reasons why this phenomenon is so compelling. It affects people from all over the world, telling similar stories. There's a consistency to these stories, thousands of these stories. So people can't be getting together and agreeing on this story to tell. On the other hand, there are many little individual aspects of these stories, countless, I would say, details that are individual, that seem almost impossible to make up. The shape of the medical instruments that these people say they remember being used on them in the ships, the air in the spaceships that they remember, the look of these beings that they remember. Everybody's got a slightly different, way of expressing this, and yet there's a basic consistency. In some cases, there's third-party corroboration. John Mack told the story of two girls who had a sleepover, and during the night, they remembered they had seen a UFO outside the house. During the night, one of the mothers came down to check on the kids at the sleepover, and they were gone. So she completely panicked. She called the police. They searched all over. They didn't find the girls. And later they turned up in their beds. And later they remembered, we had some kind of an encounter. It came back to them during hypnotherapy, whatever. So here was a case of a mother who said, I came down and they were gone. So there was some third-party corroboration. Sometimes there's accounts of, there's evidence, fragmentary evidence of a UFO landing. Where people said they remembered a UFO had landed. There were broken branches, the grass is disturbed. Some people have had scars they can't explain. So you put all these things together and you say, well, what is this phenomenon? Now, the skeptics say, this is a nightmare. This is sleep paralysis. This is very common. So, well, by the way, some of these experiences didn't happen during the night. during sleep. They happen in broad daylight, like with the Betty and Barney Hill driving their car. Sometimes they were witnessed, as I said, by third parties or corroborated to some extent by third parties. So these facile explanations that this is a nightmare. Well, John Mack studied nightmares. He said, I wrote a book on that. This is not a nightmare. This is too real to these people to be a nightmare. Sometimes the husband or the wife, the partner, is switched off during the night and cannot react. In usual nightmares, one party wakes up screaming and the other one says, "What happened? What happened?" In this case, the other party is switched off, dead to the world. And memory is wiped. Anyway, all these strange things. So to answer your question in a very roundabout way, I try to maintain my skepticism. It is not a part of everyday reality. And I differ with Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs in that regard, who said, these things are happening in reality. They're absolutely real. These people have been physically abducted. John Mack wasn't so sure about that. It's happening in some reality, somehow, that we can't explain. And I would say that is closer to my conclusion, that it's happening in some reality that we don't understand, some dimension, perhaps. Not in everyday reality, because we don't see it happening every day on the street.
I think it was Jacques Vallée who coined the term, maybe it was somebody else, but the omnijective rather than the subjective or the objective reality. He picked omnijective, I think was the term. It was somewhere kind of a mix in between, and we don't know what factors lead to the opening of a door or the collision of those two realities that we're used to. And I think I said Whitley Strieber. Did Strieber go on the vision quest? I know Graham Hancock, Fingerprints of the Gods. I think he ended up going down there, but down that road, and maybe in search of this meshing of the two realms. And so, how? I guess I'll come out and ask you: have you had any sort of experiences, that you would consider having had a glimpse behind the veil, so to speak?
I have not, and John Mack had not, except for his holotropic breathing experiences where he encountered another reality. As I said, he was born back to his earliest childhood, even before he was born, or so he felt. And in another episode, he felt he went back to he remembered himself, or thought he did, as a Russian peasant watching his son being decapitated by a Mongol warrior, to a very horrific memory, or so he thought. But apart from that, he was never abducted. He never even saw a UFO. I haven't either. But if you're asking my personal beliefs, I believe that there is more to existence than the reality we are familiar with, because of all these stories of people who encountered anomalous things, ghosts and Bigfoot and near-death experiences or so. I don't think we know everything there is to know yet. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Physics is still discovering things about the nature of the universe that is pretty bizarre, that objects can affect each other even though they're widely separated, that thinking about an experiment can change an experiment, that people seem to have some powers that we don't understand, to remote viewing, to see things at great distances, to project their minds, to sense an impending event. The mind is very strange. We don't understand all these things, and science is perplexed. There's no definitive answer yet on these powers of the mind. There's some interesting anecdotal evidence of mental powers that seem to be very astonishing. Okay, But we don't know. Look at the leaps that science has made in the last century. I mean, television, radio, internet. I mean, all these. We got to, it took the Wright brothers. After the Wright brothers, I think it was only 63 years. I forgot the math. 66 years between the development of powered flight and the landing on the moon. I mean, in 66 years, if you can go from the first airplane to a rocket to the moon, and in 66 years, what could be accomplished in a few centuries? So I guess I'm very open-minded about what we may yet find, but I don't know. We've gotten off the track a little bit, but I think there's still a lot to be found out about these experiences, and I certainly don't rule them out as of course they're impossible. They're impossible in our understanding of reality. They're impossible. But you listen to these people and you look at the things that have happened and you say, well, I don't understand. At last, as I say, at last I don't understand.
And I think the assumption that science has made about the separateness of things, the discrete nature of things, the materialistic viewpoint, wherever you look, and all these subjects you just named, UFOs and quantum physics and whatever, we discovered that it all points to an interconnectedness of things. And that's really the underlying theme. So you said we're getting off track, but I think that's the place that you always end up in these discussions as you start going, well, what's the connection between these things? So I had one more question. Let me see. What was it? I don't remember. Go ahead, Dan. I know you're looking to say something.
Well, what I'm interested in, and you actually referred to it, I'm interested in a lot of things, obviously, but you referred to this earlier, the blowback that Ralph might have gotten for his foray into talking about the UFOs and that community. I'm kind of interested in what happened to John at Harvard, because he almost went through some kind of inquisition, which you talk about in your book. Ralph, do you want to talk about his academia's response to John?
Yeah, absolutely. Inquisition is a word that I use because the powers at Harvard used it when they called John Mack in and told him that they were conducting not an inquisition. So you tell a psychiatrist that I'm conducting not an inquisition. As a psychiatrist is going to say, well, why did you use that word?
Right.
And in ways it was intrusive as an inquisition. It inquired into his beliefs, his finances, who was paying for this research. Did he believe in UFOs himself? And all these things. This was a panel that Harvard put together that was really quite conventionally scientific, you could say, without much interest in, frankly, kind of hostile to the idea that there were dimensions to the cosmos that we didn't understand. And they kept pressing Mack like, well, what do you mean that it's not, that you can't can you scientifically prove that these people have been encountering aliens, and why can't you prove it? And he said, well, it's not amenable to proof that science can summon yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. And they were pretty hard on him there. Well, what do you mean? Why, if you can't prove it scientifically, it doesn't exist. Reality is what we see every day. That's reality. And what do you mean by another reality? So they kept pressing him, and he said, look, all I know is that these people have been encountering something that I can't explain. So they conducted this inquisition for more than a year. And John Mack got two very, very good lawyers, lucky for him. One was Eric McLeish, who had broken the priest abuse scandal in Boston just before that. So he was quite renowned, and he was a very good lawyer. And Danny Sheehan, a Jesuit lawyer who had investigated the Karen Silkwood plutonium poisoning case and the Ku Klux Klan and the Iran-Contra arms scandal of the Reagan administration. So he was very political and very smart. And they both, Eric McLeish and Danny Sheehan, realized that Mack was being, scrutinized for his beliefs and not necessarily for anything he did wrong. And they defended him very vigorously. And in the end, Harvard's basically exonerated him. They said, the only complaint we have with you, John, is that you were a little too enthusiastic about some of these unorthodox research paths you had taken. And he basically agreed. I was a little too passionate. I should have been a little more, distant. I should have been a little more conventional, whatever. So he kind of agreed. He gave them that. But he did nothing wrong. He was not disciplined. He remained a member of good standing of the psychiatric department. And he went on to do some other interesting things, by the way, before he was killed. He investigated crop circles in England.
Right, crop circles. Near-death experiences?
Death experiences. He was writing a book on a colleague, a woman, Elizabeth Targ, actually the daughter of Russell Targ, who had done all the remote viewing experiments. Elizabeth was a wonderful young psychiatrist who had studied the power of distant prayer on AIDS patients and found that AIDS patients who had been prayed for did better than the control group that had not been prayed for. And then she got the same brain cancer that some of the patients she was discovering, some of the patients she was researching had gotten. Very sad story, and she died. And after she died, there were stories about her spirit being encountered, reappearing, and John Mack was very interested in that.
Well, didn't, in your book, it seems like in the epilogue to your book, you talked about John Mack showing up in spiritual form to some people. Was that?
Yeah, I left that for the end of the book because it's pretty controversial, and I did not want it to taint, the rest of the book. But I certainly wanted to include it that after he died, I mean, he had studied this phenomenon of he was haunted by the question, what happens after we die? And there's some reason to believe that he was almost looking forward to this last investigation after he died. So I don't want to say that he committed suicide, because that wasn't true. But he was very interested in what happens after we die. So I tell the story that several stories of people who encountered his spirit after he died, and he seemed to appear to people, friends of his, in rather in physical form. I mean, they remembered hearing him, seeing him, and they told stories about it. They told me, which I put at the end of the book. Now, do I believe that was necessarily true? I don't know. They believed it. And they told a couple of anecdotes that really were hard to dismiss. But anyway, it was his ultimate investigation at the end of his life. What happens after we die? And it's a mystery that is with us, like, the abduction encounters. It's probably the greatest human mystery there is, greater than anything else. I mean, are we alone in the universe is one big mystery. What happens after we die is maybe even a bigger mystery, because everyone's going to confront it. So there you go.
So what were the circumstances of his death? I don't know that I ever heard the. Was somebody charged? Was it a?
Yeah.
Is there any conspiratorial aspect to his death. I would guess
there
maybe.
were a
Well,
lot
yeah,
of,
I don't know the details of it, but I'm sure Ralph.
yeah, there were a lot of rumors that I dealt with in my book because he was such a controversial figure in his life that when he's suddenly run down in London,
Yeah.
that the rumors would quickly circulate. Oh, he's been assassinated. But I dispose of those rumors in my book. The police knew exactly who ran him down. He was a charity
Well,
worker.
you don't have to spoil your book if you don't want to. I just wanted to know that if somebody was.
It was not a conspiracy. It was not it's not a spoiler. It's good to know this.
Okay, good.
It grounds the book in reality. And, I don't want to make mysteries where they don't exist. A charity worker in London had too much to drink. It was late at night. John Mack was tired. He got out of the subway station. He was there in London for a conference on Lawrence of Arabia because his book had come out 30 years before. He was a recognized expert in the field, so they were very happy to have him talking about Lawrence. He was staying with a friend. He got out of the subway late at night. He was tired. He was supposed to call his friend to pick him up. He decided to walk. He wasn't familiar with the neighborhood. He looked the wrong way, and this car came, and boom, that was it. Now, the police investigated this guy. He'd had too much to drink. It wasn't a mystery. He didn't see John Mack. John Mack stepped in front of his car at the last minute and was almost instantly killed. He survived a little bit and died in the hospital. But one of the rumors I heard was widely repeated was that another John Mack was run down about the same time somewhere else. So it shows that John Mack was being, hunted. Not true that I could find. Maybe another John Mack was killed somewhere, but had no relationship to John Mack. But what did happen, and I tell the story in my book, was that John Mack had a colleague at Harvard who was actually a protege, another psychiatrist who I talk about in my book, who was on a trip to Russia with his wife to give a lecture about the same time that John Mack was in England, at the same time. And this other psychiatrist was driving from the airport in St. Petersburg, Russia, to his hotel with his wife in a taxi, and he looks out the window and he sees somebody getting run over in St. Petersburg, Russia, getting run down and run over by a car and probably killed. And his driver just kept on going. And it troubled him a lot to see this, obviously. And later, he heard that John Mack, his friend John Mack, had been run down in London right around the same time. Now, again, that's a weird synchronicity. You can't explain it. Was it, some kind of a link linked in the cosmos that these two events would happen? I don't know, but it's one of these very strange things that life has for us. Anyway, but to answer your question, and it's not a spoiler in the book because that's not one of the mysteries I grapple with. Was he killed or not? He was not killed. He was killed, but he was not deliberately killed.
Right.
So I can dispose of that one.
So we're coming up to the end of our time here. Dave, is there anything else, place you want to go? There's maybe one other thing I had, but if you have some place you want to take Ralph, go for it.
I'll look at my notes here, but why don't you go ahead with your last question?
Okay. And it's just kind of a conclusionary statement. So what are we to take from the life of John Mack? What are we to take away from his research? And where do you think that's what kind of doors will that open?
Good question. I find at the end of my book, John Mack was a hero. I try to remain non-judgmental throughout the book. I try to let the stories of his research, the controversial areas that he entered, speak for themselves. His critics went at him for not being skeptical enough or various mistakes he made, and he made some. And I kind of let the stories tell themselves. But at the end of the book, I kind of drop the veil and I say, I do think he was a hero in the sense that he challenged conventional thinking. He risked his career. He fit the Joseph Campbell prototype of someone who's called to a mission. He doesn't understand really, like maybe Jonah in the Bible, who doesn't want to, go on God's mission, and he gets swallowed by the whale, and attains some kind of knowledge and comes back to share his knowledge with humanity, which is what I think John Mack did. He went through a lot of terrifying experiences through the people he counseled. He jeopardized his career. He suffered greatly, but he overcame his challenges, and he came back with a boon for humanity, which is the knowledge that he had gained. So I think in that sense, he does fit the hero, label. The one thing I would like to say, because you mentioned last thoughts, I use the word believer as the title of the book in almost an ironic sense, because the word is used very often in a pejorative way. Oh, you're just a believer. You don't really have a scientific frame of mind. You're just a believer. And friends of John Mack sometimes looked askance at that use of the word believer in my title. And I explained to them, which I explained in the book, that he was a believer in things that I admire. He was a believer in social justice. He was a believer in solving earthly problems. He was a believer in pushing the boundaries and risking his reputation to follow a mystery that remains today. That's what he believed in. He didn't just blindly swallow the stories of people. That's not how I use the word believer. But he believed in risking his reputation to find out something that remains a mystery. So I think that's an important point to make, because I don't want people to look at the book and say, oh, he's just a believer. He just blindly believed that these. He certainly did not. He investigated them very thoroughly, and I conclude, like he did, that there is no answer that we know of today to this mystery. We do not know what these people have encountered, why only certain people encounter them, why aren't other people, quote, abducted? That's a good question. Why only certain people? What is it about these people? Some of them said they were implanted with alien devices to track them. And some of them said, well, my parents were abducted before me. They told me they had the experience. My grandparents had. So it seems to run in families. We know that from their account. Why does it run in families and not other families? These are all legitimate questions, but there are no answers. And I think that's why it certainly was worth my time to spend 16 years on this book. And I think people have to come to this question with some humility.
I bought the book on Amazon. Where else can you get it?
All the bookstores have it. If they don't have it, they'll order it. Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores. I love independent bookstores because they're the backbone of, you don't have to get every book on Amazon. They're big enough, but they've been good to me. They've sold the book, obviously, but it's widely available through independent bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. There's an audio book as of this month. So people, if you're riding in your car or you you have trouble with your eyesight, a lot of people actually came out to me and said, is there an audio book? Because I have trouble reading. And now I'm happy to say, yes, there is. And you can get it easily. It's on Kindle. So if you don't want to wait for it to arrive in a physical form, you can get it on your device. And that's another quick way to read it instantly. You don't have to wait. So it's widely available, I'm happy to say, and I'm very pleased at the reaction I've gotten so far.
Did you get a good reaction from his kids?
I did, actually. He has 3 sons, and I was a little nervous, frankly, because they gave me access to his archives without asking for a pre-approval, which I would not have given, because my time's training obviously convinced me that you cannot write an authorized biography with only on the approval of the family or the subject. In this case, he was dead, but his family. And I would not have done that because I would not have wanted to be, hamstrung by any need to appeal to them or leave anything out because it would offend them. So I had completely free reign. They gave it to me. They didn't ask any conditions. They first saw the book when it was published. They read it and they said that they were very pleased with it. I'm very happy to hear that. And his friends came out to me afterwards and said that they liked the portrait I made of him, some of his romantic interests, because he was interested in women other than his wife. And his wife was very devoted to him, and she was long suffering and understood his extramarital adventures as much as any wife ever could, which is to say, not very much.
Yeah, not very much.
But she loved him throughout his life. He was very good to her. That's a whole other thing, how he was drawn to other women, looking for this missing figure in his life, maybe his mother. But anyway, he had a few romances. He wasn't, I'm not going to suggest he was out of control, but he had a few romances, long-term romances in his life outside his marriage. And I spoke to those women, and they were very helpful to me, and they liked the portrait that I assembled of him. So it gave me confidence to know that people who knew him well, knew him the best, recognized the portrait of him and thought it came out well. So I was very comforted by that.
What are you working on next?
Well, I'm still doing publicity on this, including this interview. It's a long-term project. There are other articles to be done on this. I haven't laid this to rest. It's a prevailing, confounding mystery that you can't, unlike all the other books I've done, and this is the 7th, it's a hard book to put behind you and say, okay, I've done that now, and now I'm going to move on to something else. This gets a hold of you, and so I don't know what I'm going to do next, to tell you the truth. But I'm not ready to let this rest. This is plus there's continuing interest in this. I get invited on a lot of events, and I did a conference in the desert and virtual this year where I gave a lecture and a workshop. So I'm happy to say that the interest is continuing. I'm in Exeter, New Hampshire now, teaching for the summer, but Exeter is ground zero,
right?
For the incident at Exeter.
Somebody that you might want to connect with is, we did a show with Gwen Farrell, who's a friend of ours. She's also the director of the Experiences Research. Well, no, I guess it's Resources team. They've renamed that. But she deals with people all the time who've had alien abduction encounters or contact. Maybe not all of them are abductions, but contacts. But she might be an interesting conversation with you if you want.
I would like Gwen what?
It's Farrell, Farrell. And she's in
New Hampshire?
Oh, she's in, Gwen is in one of the worst places I could think of this time of year. Phoenix, Arizona.
Phoenix, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, we've got, on my Facebook page, we've got our conversation.
Oh, good. I will look that up.
Yeah, very interesting, very nice person.
Great. Thank you.
Dave, what else? Got any final thoughts?
Well, Ralph brought up the term believer and noted how it's used as a negative term, a pejorative. You're a true believer. Well, I think a worse, more negative term is disbeliever. And that's the people who just don't believe no matter what evidence crosses in front of them, or they don't, worse yet, they don't even look at the evidence. You still run into a lot of people like that who won't even consider certain types of evidence, just, off the top. They're just not going to go there. I think it's happening less and less. And again, thanks to the New York Times and some of these other media outfits that have been brave enough to even cover the UFO subject. I think it's becoming harder and harder to become just a flat out disbeliever, because you kind of look like you're being left behind. You're not with the times, pun intended here, but I'm hoping that's the way that things are moving. And Ralph also touched on the hero's journey. Do you have a mission in your life? Some researchers appear to have a bigger mission, or at least it's more public, but I tend to believe that every person has his or her own hero's journey and a direction that they feel compelled to move in. And I'm wondering, Dan kind of stole my thunder in asking what's your next step, Ralph. No, we're just psychically connected, that's all. But I'm wondering what do you see, Ralph? You write another book. I mean, are you continuing this direction, do you think, or are you not even to that point? It kind of sounds like you're not quite ready to even consider another.
I am not quite ready. But, what I often say when I talk to authors groups or young journalists, I say books pick people, pick authors rather than authors picking books. So every book I've written sort of landed in my lap in a strange way. And I told you about the John Mack story, how I was in Texas for the New York Times when his book landed in my lap, and I got interested in this whole subject, which I had not intended. And other books I had, came to me in a similar way, not because I sat down and said, what am I going to write my next book about? But because something happened that pushed me in that direction. And, I believe that the universe has some strange pushes and pulls, not easy to analyze or explain or so, but things happen in a strange way sometimes, very often in a strange way, that push you in a certain direction. How you meet your partner in life, what career you get pushed into. May not be completely accidental. There are these synchronicities that strange connections and wormholes in reality, in the cosmos, that suck us in. And so I don't know. I guess I'm waiting for the next thing to push me in another direction. But for now, there's still plenty to do on this.
Yeah, just keep your eyes and ears open, and when the opportunity arises, I think that's when you make the choice, or the choice is made for you, I guess you could also argue.
Right.
But thank you, Ralph. I want to say this is a great, I really appreciate the time. We're about an hour and a half here. Dan's the ultimate timekeeper, but I know I can see we're pushing up against it, but I've had a good time, and I really appreciate the information that you brought us.
And I would echo that. Thanks very much for taking time to talk to us.
Great. You guys are terrific. Thank you for your interest, and it's a pleasure to talk to you, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you again.
All right. Bye-bye, Ralph.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Take care, guys.
You too.